In this video, we're going to be going over project and task automation within Zoho Projects. Zoho's done a lot to improve this functionality over the last year or so I thought I would do an update video here and just cover all of the features available for you. Before I jump in, I do want to ask, if you find this video useful, please be sure to like and subscribe down below, as that really does help us out. And if it sparks any questions, leave those in the comments section down below that like button, as we do try to get back to as many of those as we possibly can every single week. If you find yourself getting stuck doing this for yourself in your Zoho account, head over to zenatta.com, click on that book a meeting link, and we'll be chatting about how we can help very shortly. With that, let's jump on into the walkthrough. So I'm here inside of Zoho Projects, and really what we want to focus in on today is automation. And so what I've done is I've spun up a little example project here in case we find ourselves needing to use it. So in the settings up here in the top right, really where all of this lives that we're going to be covering today is under project automation and task automation. Now, those are broken down into two categories because the trigger points of those automations will be different. So things that are in this project automation category will trigger when updates are made to a project record itself, whereas as you would expect, the task automation is going to trigger specifically for updates made to tasks. What I've found is that realistically, you're going to end up doing a lot of your automation via the tasks, just because you can get a lot more specific around what you're trying to communicate about. But we are still going to spend just a little bit of time covering the project automation right out of the gate. As with most Zoho applications, all of these automation tools are going to be nested under what they will call a workflow. A workflow is essentially an if-then statement. So if a project is created, notify this person. If a project is completed, notify a different person. And so we'll be able to come in here and kind of take a look at how exactly these work. Up in the top right, I'm going to click New Workflow Rule. I'll give this a name. We'll just call it our example rule. You always want to have a nice and descriptive name on these. You could find a situation in the future where you have 10, 11, 12 workflows that are all running. So being able to quickly and easily identify kind of what they're doing, what was the purpose, is an important step of the process. Now, up here at the top, this first little section here is kind of like the if of our automation. And so what we're going to say is if a project is created, if there's a comment, if there's an update, if it's either archived or unarchived, or if it's trashed, we'll go ahead and proceed with this automation. In our case, I'm going to say updated for our case. And you'll see as you kind of go through and select these, some of them are going to have little extra pop-ups. So specifically, this is updated. Now we'll give you this field selector. So really what you're doing here is you're saying, only run this rule when I have an update to a specific field. A really common one for that is something like start date or end date, right? So like if we back up the start date of a project, somebody probably needs to know about that. If we are backing up or moving forward the end date, kind of the same thing. Another really common one is status, right? So if a project goes to a new status, let's make sure that people are aware of that. So I'm going to use status in our case, and then we'll move on to this criteria block. So the criteria block is like the second half of our if statement. So what we're looking at here is essentially if a project has a status update such that potentially the status equals a certain value. So let's say maybe delayed. That would be one that we would definitely want to notify people that this is happening. Then we're going to do some things. Oops, I exited out of that. We'll go ahead and just reselect it here. And so now essentially, I always like to read through these as English whenever I'm doing walkthroughs on workflows. So when a project has a status update to delayed, what exactly do we want to do? And that's where you'll have these actions. So these are like the then portion of that if-then statement. And so the different types of things we can do are update fields. This would essentially just be like changing a particular field value. Common example might be if something gets delayed, we're going to reassign it to somebody else. Maybe we're going to escalate things a little bit. Or if something gets delayed, we're going to back up the end date of that project. You know, those types of updates, or maybe you're going to group it differently and go like, hey, these need to go into the escalated group of projects. So field actions can be really useful just for making sure that different pieces of data stay in line with one another as things are changing on that project. Another one would be associating a webhook. This is more of a developer tool, but what a webhook is a structured way to send data from Zoho Projects out to somewhere else. And this could be like sending it to a tool like Zapier or Zoho Flow. Maybe you're sending it to a custom application that you've built. I won't go too far down the nitty gritty on webhooks, but essentially you're able to come in here and say where this is going and what I want to send. So I want to send the portal name, I want to send the project name, whatever it may be, and I want to post that over to this third-party location. Again, we're not going to go fully down the rabbit hole on webhooks. Another developer option that you have here is the ability to associate a custom function. These are the custom functions that are written in Zoho's Deluge language, a little scripting language that is implemented in the majority of these applications. We do a lot of this internally at Zenatta. There's a lot of functionality in Zoho that does work best when we're using a custom function. Again, I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole on these because it's a little more developer-centric, but good news is if you know Deluge in one Zoho app, you essentially know it in all of them other than some minor structural differences with the data itself. Last option is the ability to associate an email alert. This is honestly the one that I would say is the most commonly used, especially when we're talking about project automations. Again, if we kind of carry this example forward, if a project is being identified as delayed, there's probably someone who needs to know about it. And so we can create an email alert. We'll call this our delayed project alert because I'm not very creative. Here we can create many different email templates. I'll show you that in just a moment. We'll go ahead and just select this default one. We can choose who should be notified based on their association. So that could either be the project owner, likely like the project manager, or the person who created the project. Created by is a little less useful because they aren't always the one who is primarily responsible for it at that point. At the end of the day, that'll just kind of base on your particular requirements. Lastly here, under the other notifications, we can send this out kind of en masse to other roles. This would be like maybe you have an escalations team and we're going to say, hey, everybody on that team gets a notification if something is being delayed. Last one here is just a place where I can type in any old email address that I want to ensure that notifications are going specifically to them. This is more of a use case where like maybe you have one person that does a certain thing and you just want to notify them whenever it occurs. In our case, we'll just send this out to the manager team. So we'll click save and then associate, and then we can save this rule. Now, again, that's most of it when it comes to the project notifications. Like I mentioned, over here on the left under email templates is where I can create new emails that I want to have go out. Here, of course, you can merge in data from the project itself to make sure that things are dynamic so people know what project this is about. Maybe you give them a link to the record just using these templates. With the project side out of the way, let's jump into task automation because this is really where the bulk of automation will occur. I'm going to start with workflow rules because we'll go kind of quick. They work very similarly to what I just showed on the project side. So I can create a workflow rule. Well, again, always give it a name. Even in my demo account, they got to have something. Here, similar types of triggers, right? Updated, commented, deleted. We do have this different one where a document is attached. That's a really nice trigger point for some types of businesses. You know, imagine like somebody needs to make a blueprint, they attach it to the task, and then now it notifies that person to say, hey, we're ready to move forward. The blueprint's been created. Here, again, I'll use this similar thing of updating a status on a task. We'll say that we'll run this when the status equals a certain value. Now, you do have to be careful in here. I just made the mistake, so I'll highlight it. You do have to be careful when you're working in the task workflows because it will let you use criteria from the project as a part of that workflow. So this is a case where maybe like if this project is in a particular group, we're going to treat it a little bit differently than if it's just a normal project. Or maybe if this project is strict, meaning like you have hard deadlines on it, then we really need to automate this notification. Where if something isn't a strict project, maybe we don't need to. So it is a nice feature here. You're able to actually pull fields from projects and milestones because again, you kind of have project, milestone, task as those three different layers of hierarchy. In our case, we're going to focus in on the task status. And let's say that this is something that, again, maybe is delayed or to be tested or on hold, whatever those actions may be. Under this actions section, we have that exact same thing that we did on the projects. So I can update fields, I can post webhooks, I can run functions, and I can associate email alerts. So webhooks and functions work essentially the same, so I'm not going to highlight those. What I do want to show is that you are able to update a bit more, like you got the different fields here that are specific to the particular task rather than to the project. I will highlight if you wanted to, let's say, run a workflow on a task to update a field on the related project or on the related milestone, you would need to do that with a bit of deluge code. Common one there is that if a task gets delayed, maybe we want to bump the end date of the project by a couple days. Again, that is going to have to be a deluge function. If you get stuck there, again, shameless plug, head over to Zenatta.com. We're happy to help out. Last one here is email alert. I will highlight this just because there are some extra options. So very similarly to the other notifications in the project section, we can notify the owner of the project, the creator of the project. We can select those various roles and teams, but we also have this extra section for people that are specifically related to this task. So a really common one is, hey, whoever owns this should be notified if something happens. Created by is actually more commonly used, what I've seen inside of task automations, because a project manager might go ahead and create a task and assign it to somebody else. That's a really common thing that would occur. And so if something was to be delayed, we would probably want to let that project manager know based on the fact that they were the one who created that task. Last thing I will highlight here on the emails is that it is a different set of templates because you're able to pull different pieces of information into those templates when you're sending them out via the task. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this workflow. All that we would really need to do there is just select that template, save it, and move on forward. And so the last two things here that we want to show as part of the automation suite of Zoho Projects is the blueprints and macro rules. So these are essentially two different ways to continue automating the tool. So a macro rule, as it sounds, if you use macros in other systems, we'll call this an example macro, and we'll click next. Really what this is a set of statuses. So maybe we're going to say if task status is, I'm not creative, so we'll just say delayed. We can update particular fields. Really, it's just a simpler way to go ahead and create a certain workflow without going through all of the steps. I'll tell you, the macros, we don't find a lot of times where we really use them. They are useful, but generally anything you could do with a macro, you can also do with a workflow rule. And having all those automations in one place is going to make life a whole lot easier. Last section here that we want to take a look at are blueprints. Now, if you're familiar with blueprints in CRM or Zoho Desk, they are very similar. What a blueprint is a structured way to move through a set of fields. Primarily what we're going to look at here is around like task status. When we are creating a blueprint, they're going to be specific for a particular type of layout. This is the layout of a task, not of a project. Important distinction there. I'm going to choose my software development layout. Here we can choose criteria. So maybe, I don't think you should do this, but maybe you would say, hey, if it's a strict project, we work through blueprints. If it's not a strict project, we don't. I wouldn't really advise you to do that in particular, just because you want to lock in this process as closely as you can. But what we will oftentimes do is maybe add a custom field to the tasks, set that field as either requires blueprint or not requires blueprint at the template level, and then make sure that all of those types of tasks enter through our blueprinted process. In our case, we're not going to worry too much about the criteria here. We're really more focused on just getting things, all tasks going into this particular blueprint. So I'll click save. Now here over on the right, what we have are all of the different statuses that are a part of this task layout. And so to get started building out your blueprint, what we're going to do is just drag in the first task status of open. And then I'm going to drag in the second task status of in progress. And what we'll see is that really, again, similar to if you played with these in CRM, you're kind of drawing the different paths that things can take from one status to another. Now, if I click on this little plus button, this is really where you get the meat and potatoes here of the transitions. So we'll call this our start work transition, because that would move it from open to in progress. We can make these a common transition, meaning that we can actually have a transition run from multiple different statuses. So for example, you might have something that goes to testing, and then you want it to be able to come back to in progress because maybe there was an issue and we need to get back to work on it. Now I could come in and make this a common transition where we can move through the start work from either open or from testing, right? And so now I don't have to create another kind of duplicate transition that does the same thing. Instead, I'm able to reuse one transition for a variety of different status updates. When I actually select on this start work transition, we'll see over on the right, there are kind of 3 categories of settings for each and every transition. The first one is before. So before is essentially defining who should be able to do this transition. So should it only be the task owner? Should it be the task owner and the person it was created by? Are there particular roles that should just always be able to do this? And then secondarily, are there any criteria where this transition should or should not appear? In our case, a lot of the time there aren't too many criteria when it comes into, these task blueprints. One that you might have is like if the task date is in the future, then it shouldn't show this, right? We shouldn't be able to actually start work on this if it's maybe unscheduled. So maybe it's like, hey, we need to get this on the calendar before we can actually consider starting work. These criteria statements can have multiple different options within them, and you can control the and or criteria that connect the various settings together. The during section is essentially what's going to happen exactly when that person presses the button. And so if I look at the different things I can do, I can essentially require fields or comments and attachments. So I could say, hey, once you start work on this, you must define if it's billable or non-billable. Maybe we don't know up until a certain point, but hey, if we're going to start work, we definitely need to know that. Or maybe you want to say, hey, every time that we start work, leave a comment saying what exactly you're planning on doing. Another option here, so I'll go ahead and add those. Another option here would be to display an info message. And so an info message is really just a statement that will pop up when a user actually presses that button. So I'll just say info message. We'll call it the example info message. Then the after criteria is where a lot of the automated actions happen. So just like those task workflows, we have email alerts, field updates, custom functions, and webhooks, all of which that can be triggered upon moving through a particular status. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to clean this up just a little so I can show you what these look like easily here, and then I'll publish. So this workflow, obviously not done, right? Like we would need to work in the rest of these statuses, but I do just want to show exactly what is going to happen as you move through the various steps. So we'll go ahead and just call this closed, and then we'll publish. Now, if I go over to my software development project, again, really important here because these aren't going to trigger if we're not in the right layout. But in this case, because we are in that correct layout, we'll have the ability to work these through the blueprints. All right, so I had to give it a minute there to apply the blueprints. But what we'll see is that when I'm in this task, I can no longer just update this status field, right? This is now locked because there is a specific way that I need to move through this transition in order for us to make sure that we're getting the process that we need. So if I click Start Work, that's the name of the button that we added. I can choose if this is billable or non-billable. Again, these are just those fields that we had added. We can leave a comment because we said we have to. And then we've got this little info message here, which will oftentimes be like instructions or things to be aware of as you're completing this step. Now, when I click Complete, we'll see that the task has now moved in progress. Status is still locked. And now I could click Close to actually close out the task. One really important thing to note here is that blueprints are restrictive by their very nature. And so you need to make sure that every different eventuality is covered if you are going to use one. Because what you'll find is now that I've added this to a blueprint, I wouldn't be able to move this task to UAT done because it's not part of that blueprinted process. And there would just be no way for me to override that while the blueprint is active. Just something to be aware of, because it's always important to decide how important is it to very tightly manage the process versus allow a little bit of flexibility. And that's a big part of why we want to have those criteria set up on blueprints, because maybe not all tasks need to move through such a strict and regimented process. So with that, I think we've covered all of the core automation options here within Zoho Projects. As always, thank you so much for watching. We appreciate it greatly. If you found this video useful, please be sure to like and subscribe down below, as that really does help us out. And if it sparks any feedback, questions, or additional video requests, leave those in the comments section below that like button, as we do try to read through each and every one of those on a weekly basis. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.